They weren't just praying, they were farming, better than most of us do today. For centuries, monks across Europe and Asia developed secret gardening techniques, underground heating, lunar planting schedules, seed networks, and more. Their methods fed the sick, healed the poor, and built botanical empires. Today on Stellar Eureka, we're uncovering monastic garden hacks that could transform your backyard and outsmart modern farming. Moving along the monastery boundary wall, a novice came up to a small oak door that opened into darkness. As he stepped in and made his way through the narrow passages, he could only hear slight movements of water. As the darkness started to fade, he noticed one robed figure, then another, and then several. Running parallel to the garden beds above, this was engineered knowledge far beyond what most medieval peasants could access. Before elaborate plumbing allowed radiators to heat rooms and gas heaters became common, medieval monks were utilizing underfloor heating to create their own greenhouses. The natural warming protected roots from frost and cold stress, extending the seasons for specific plants. Subterranean heating and irrigation systems were exclusive to monks in the Middle Ages, but the technique can be traced back to the Romans, who used hypocaust devices to heat baths and villas. But during the Dark Ages, they were gradually phased out because of a major loss of knowledge, a lack of centralized political and economic powers to invest in such projects, and a focus on short-term subsistence farming. Monastic orders, however, did not suffer from these issues. In addition to strong educational roots, they held political power, had access to funds and skilled masons to build durable stoneworks, had institutional longevity to maintain structures, and wanted access to year-round medicinal plants to run their infirmaries. It would be natural to question why they didn't extend this knowledge to local farmers. Well, sometimes they did, as you've seen in our video, The History of Superfoods and Medicinal Plants. However, other times monastic secrecy prevented them from breathing a word to the locals. Just as narrow underground corridors were hiding monastic secrets, so were large walls constructed above to protect their Hortus Conclusus, or paradise on earth. Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine order, emphasized the need for a healthy lifestyle and a structured routine, making use of both active and contemplative times every day. So, ora et labora, meaning pray and work, became one of the leading principles of Western monasticism. The work part included caring for the sick and gardening, as these habits helped establish harmony. Monks spent specific hours of the day tending to vineyards, orchards, vegetable plots, and medicinal herb gardens. Medicine was ritual, leaves dried only on holy days, tinctures brewed with rhythmic prayer chants. Filled with scents of rosemary and sage, these enclosed cloister gardens, or Hortus Conclusus in Latin, were enclosed for multiple reasons. Walls and fences not only protected against thieves and wild animals, but they also provided thermal mass, creating a warmer, less windy environment for the plants. Monks experimented with their crops in this sacred space. In the scorching heat of Africa and the Middle East, Christian monasteries combined vineyards, mills, and granaries into a massive system, which allowed them to develop unique concoctions and blends. Henna mandrake, colocynth, rue, wormwood, and fennel featured heavily in these recipes. Farmers grew these plants too, but only monks knew how to turn them into elixirs. Monastery pharmacies managed plants at scale, allowing them to exhaustively record specific chemical behaviors. They could use this knowledge to create exclusive ointments, fermented tonics, and poultices that the locals could not have developed on their own. Did you know that the holy myrrh Orthodox Christians use for consecration and initiation was actually perfected by monastic communities in Egyptian deserts? At one point, the Greek practice of creating holy myrrh included 57 aromatic botanicals. That was before Saint Athanasius of Alexandria introduced the practice of adding old myrrh to the new batch, standardizing the new method of production. There was also a religious aspect to these gardens. Grown in isolation, the violets were symbols of humility, the evergreens of eternal life, and the oak saplings of persistence and dedication. Just like the plants needed moderate exposure to potentially hostile elements, so did the soul need to temper itself against worldly desires. Similarly, the three states of water in these gardens, bubbling, spouting, and moving waters, represented the Holy Trinity. The Easter lilies and palm fronds were required for religious services. Every time monks walked across the cross-shaped design of the gravel paths, they had a chance to reflect on the pilgrim's inward journey. While European abbots were connecting with nature in seclusion, Asian monks were attracting attention for their cosmic designs on the other side of the world. If you were walking in India during the Vedic period, there is a small chance you would find yourself in Vatikas, Sanskrit for gardens. But these were not your average gardens. These were grown according to the Indian principles of Vastu Shastra, an ancient Indian science of architecture and spatial design. Balancing earth, water, fire, air, and space elements, it provided systematic guidelines for achieving harmony with cosmic forces. The central tenet of this science was the mandala, a circular spiritual symbol that first appeared in the Hindu text, the Rig Veda. This concentric geometric design represented the marriage of higher thought and spirituality. Buddhism and other local religions adapted these ideas and spread them across China and Southeast Asia. A great example of this is Samye, Tibet's first Buddhist monastery, which is laid out in the shape of a giant mandala. However, Chinese monastic gardens slowly moved away from radial mandalas and adopted axial compositions. Monastic gardens utilized peripheral rings and quadrants for symbolic as well as functional goals. Let's take Indian sites, for example. They were oriented to the cardinal directions before a Vastu Purusha mandala of a 64 by 81 square grid was superimposed over them. Stone pathways traced geometric precision, while fragrance from the surrounding flowers hovered above them. Concentric and radial beds created windbreaks, heat traps, and shade gradients. The Vriksha Yurveda, or plant lore, helped establish the rituals and cardinality of Ayurvedic medicine. Due to the ritualized nature of monastic orders, the sacred geometry was not so much a secret as a class-based phenomenon. Enlightenment lay strictly in the hands of the elite. Peasants might not have had the financial ability to build extensive gardens, but they did use mandala seed patterns to ensure higher yields. Asian farmers may have blessed the land with their sacred seed patterns, but European monks went a step ahead. They honored plant species by ensuring their survival. Refectories, infirmaries, and liturgies all required food, medicine, and ritual plants. So medieval monasteries came up with a straightforward idea: collecting and cataloging seeds in dedicated nurseries. In-house control over seeds and young plants reduced dependence on external markets and allowed safe production of exotic species. After harvest, seeds were cleaned off and dried to prevent mold. Rare seeds were then stored in clay jars, leather pouches, and waxed parchment packets in dry cellars and attics. Monks kept rotating seed stock, so it was always fresh. But that's not all. Imagine an exclusive plant market accessible only to certain factions, guilds, and orders. That is how monastic seed banking worked. Benedictine, Cistercian, and Cluniac houses not only cultivated rare species, but also shared them through pilgrimage and court networks. What began with Roman villa horticulture and early Christian orders was completely institutionalized by the High Middle Ages. Thanks to dedicated nurseries and the seed trade, Icelandic and Norwegian monasteries were able to cultivate medicinal plants in extreme environments. Think of a vast monastic web extending from Scandinavia to southern Italy and beyond, literally thousands of monasteries whispering guarded secrets to each other. The Coptic monasteries in Egypt were great beneficiaries of these exchange networks. Frankincense and myrrh were prized imports that arrived from beyond the eastern borders and had long been used for ancient Egyptian rituals due to their unique aromas. However, they did not grow in Egyptian deserts, and Pharaoh Hatshepsut's attempts to grow them locally had failed back in the 15th century BCE. Christ was buried in holy myrrh, so Christian monasteries in Egypt were also interested in these species. They used their vast trade networks to transport these valued plants at a much lower cost. But they didn't just import these plants, they perfected their use. Behind the sun-flamed walls of isolated Coptic communities, tiny pouches of powdered herbs and scrolls of faded ink were changing the ancient world one miracle at a time. While seed saving was not restricted to monastic orders, its scale was unreplicated among civilian populations. Inventories, correspondence, and institutional stability gave the church an upper hand in producing some of the rarest species known to man. But monks didn't just guard seeds in clay jars to hide them in underground jars. They lifted their eyes to the heavens, linking the blessings of the earth with the mysteries of the stars. Astronomical sowing rituals have been part of several ancient cultures. The Egyptians, Chinese, Mesopotamians, and Indians have all looked to the heavens for guidance. In the Middle Ages, monastic Christianity adopted this practice with a unique twist. When the average medieval man was looking to plant crops, he consulted the weather, the seasons, bird migrations, and the stars. So given their intellectual and economic prowess, what more did medieval monks take into consideration? Monastic orders promoted a highly regimented life. Monks prayed at specific hours, fasted for a certain number of days, and consulted something called the Conclusus chart to mark holy days. It only made sense to integrate lunar planting into that communal schedule. Liturgical moon gardening was the perfect melting pot of lunar rules, feast day scheduling, and practical horticulture. Surviving monastic calendars and Conclusus manuscripts record these activities in a single, cohesive system. Another aspect of monastic moon gardening was the medieval understanding of the body's humors, on which monks had read long treatises. One of the key influences on the bodily humors was the moon, so they believed that harvest timing would improve humoral potency. Today, we use thermostats, soil thermometers, timed irrigation, and moisture sensors rather than hitching our wagon to lunar timing and its road to good humors. While plant by the moon movements have returned in recent years, there's little peer-reviewed evidence to support their effectiveness. Though the ritual may still hold value, and for those who enjoy it, following the lunar calendar does no harm. In the East, however, Japanese monks were not trying to harness nature to their cause. They were simply learning how to coexist with it. In Western cultures, moss is undesirable. Not only is it shapeless, but it also attracts moisture and fungal growth, promoting rot in modern structures. However, the Japanese have a different perspective. For them, moss cultivation is a culturally rich practice. The 1,300-year-old Saihoji Temple in Japan contains at least 120 species of moss. If you happen to visit it, you'll need written permission to roam the 4.5-acre agricultural land. Moss craze is a real thing in Japan, and young women calling themselves moss girls often organize viewing parties. Japanese poetry mentions moss cultivation and integration as far back as the 8th century. For the locals today, moss represents a Japan from the distant past, untouched by foreign influences. But there's also a practical benefit. Half a square meter of moss can absorb up to 2 pounds of carbon dioxide. It purifies the air by drawing out toxins. Zen Buddhist orders selected and conserved rare species of moss, but their methods varied dramatically from European monasteries. Instead of subduing nature and storing seeds in little boxes, the Japanese cherished biodiversity and aesthetics. They wanted to coexist with nature, not chain it to their will. Monks would go out and pick moss mats from garden patches, banks, and woodland. But it wasn't a free-for-all. The species needed to match specific environments. Dry rocks demanded a different kind of moss than wet crevices. Strong custodial ethos guided temples on how to preserve various species in micro-habitats. As Zen and other Buddhist temple gardeners learned to appreciate the muted tones of moss, they realized it was not only an aesthetic feature. It played an important role in the natural change of stone colors. The average person did not have the patience or resources to even dream about planting something as annoying and commonplace as moss. Even today, growing moss in your personal garden is a difficult endeavor, as it requires proper shading, high humidity, and a lack of direct sunlight. Royal estates, however, adopted moss cultivation as a delicacy, a tradition that persists to this day. But now, this tradition is becoming increasingly mainstream. Moss lovers believe that it's the perfect representation of the Japanese ideals of wabi-sabi, transience, and imperfection. The Japanese monks found a way to appreciate the aesthetic and spiritual qualities of a seemingly useless plant. On the other hand, Christian monasteries had distilled a spiritual exercise down to a mathematical formula. The Plan of St. Gall, an architectural drawing of a Benedictine monastic compound, shows a garden divided into 16 beds which were routinely rotated. The technique avoided nutrient depletion and pathogen buildup, helping maintain soil fertility. The rotational scheme became the go-to model for monastic Physic gardens. As fennel swayed right next to calendula, the garden became a chessboard of life, ripe with ritualized dedication and representing the harmony of the universe. The monks believed a lack of rotation caused soil exhaustion, which weakened the virtue of medicinal herbs. The herbal gardens were always close to the infirmary, reducing harvest time for emergency patients. Fresh infusions could be prepared directly in the infirmary kitchens. What if an apothecary wanted to prepare rosewater and another unique concoction? Not only did he have easy access to materials, but he also had a rigid structure, knowing full well where each ingredient was planted. Even when panicking to save a soul, the infirmary staff would know exactly where the wattle-fenced square beds housed medicinal herbs like rue and sage. Beds built with manure, straw, pond silt from the stews, and wood ash had to be rotated every year, adding a layer of dynamism and rejuvenation to the gardens. The nearby institutions allowed monks to manage their Physic or herbal gardens, but they were still resource and care-intensive structures. Ordinary farmers neither had the medicinal knowledge nor the human resources to manage them. But there was one technique hidden in the mountains of Japan where local peasants helped monks increase food production. 70% of Japan is covered by mountains and hills. Terraced farming has always been common in these areas, utilizing geography to grow rice. Farmers carved into hillsides to create flat areas adjacent to slopes. Soon they would have large networks of springs, ponds, and small canals built by clay lining and stone retaining walls that fed water to each other. This was great for cultivating rice, but isolated communities would become desperate for good protein sources, and before the days of the internet and railways, they had no choice but to get creative. Since the peasants were already working with ponds, terraced aquaculture emerged as an important solution to their protein problem. Farmers would introduce common carp, medaka, and other fish in interconnected ponds. The fish would feed on pests and add protein to the diet. Temple ponds can be traced all the way back to the 8th century, but while the monks possessed the knowledge of rice fish cultivation, it was on the locals to do the hard work. However, the scale of the effort made it impossible to get anywhere without community involvement. There were plenty of questions. Which canal belonged to whom? Who decided which banks to break in case of heavy rains? This is where the temples and shrines came in. They sometimes controlled land and water rights and had the credibility to bring people together to develop large infrastructure. On the other side of the world, post-revolution French monks were doing something entirely different for protein sources, chiseling Parisian caves to grow mushrooms. As more jobs moved to the French cities in the early 19th century, French farmers decided to look elsewhere for a miracle, and they found it right beneath their feet. Thus began the story of Agaricus bisporus, or Paris mushrooms. They were abandoned limestone and gypsum quarries around Paris that provided just the right conditions for growing bisporus or button mushrooms: high humidity, cool, stable temperatures, and low light. Caves also helped trap moisture, reducing losses from evaporation. A century ago, horticulturists had already experimented with the Agaricus species in King Louis XIV's garden at Versailles, and after the French Revolution, workers found the confidence to try a similar process in their vicinities. Farmers sought out subterranean spaces like natural caves, man-made quarries, and monastery crypts to grow mushrooms. Market gardeners, quarry workers, and mushroom farmers all started small enterprises. Monks provided subterranean galleries underneath monastic properties and sometimes even offered access to cool cellars. And they had good reasons for doing it. Since some orders forbade eating meat, mushrooms became a great meat substitute for their diets. A single bisporus contains 2 to 5 grams of protein per 100 grams, which is relatively high compared to most vegetables. But back in the Middle Ages, people had different ways of trapping water. Instead of rummaging around in the darkness, they preferred to hear the gush of natural water bodies. The Middle Age stew was very different from the one we eat today. Yes, it contained lots of water, but it wasn't cooked. Stew was actually a medieval name for walled fish ponds. People kept live carp, pike, and other fish in them before shipping them off to the kitchen. These fish ponds were important because meat is forbidden for most fasting days. Certain Eastern Orthodox sects, as well as Carthusians, completely abstain from eating meat to achieve the simplicity and innocence of Adam. Abbeys with access to natural embankments, low ground basins, valley floors, and tributary channels would build large stew ponds. It gave them a year-round, reliable food source. By the High Middle Ages, monks were building stew ponds integrated with farming and horticulture. When fall came around and rustling leaves began dotting the ground, a closed-loop system allowed these multi-tiered ponds to feed water to garden headers and fill cisterns. But that was not all. As moss crept over the edges and reflections rippled across the moving water, observant minds began pondering this ecosystem. After some experiments, they realized that the muck at the bottom of these ponds was organically rich. It was prized as a soil amendment and breathed new life into vegetable beds, orchards, and herbal gardens. These hacks came in handy during hard times, as seen in our previous video, 10 Forgotten Foods That Outsmarted Famine, Disease, and Time. A great device for water storage and microclimate control, stew ponds gradually became common in Cistercian monasteries. By the late Middle Ages, manors and castles began adopting the system to great effect. It wasn't something you could exactly keep under wraps. Massive grange networks extended across multiple Cistercian estates and even began connecting with local manor ponds. Modern aquaponics utilizes the same principles by combining fish tanks with hydroponic plant beds. For centuries, steady hands behind sanctuary walls coaxed life from the soil. Whispering scripture to the plants, these orders paved the way for modern agricultural practices. From the hot and parched cloisters of Egyptian deserts to the moist, grassy patches of Japan, these monasteries were laboratories of their time. Their gardens didn't just foster plants, they were factories of knowledge. But more than anything else, the practice of monastic gardening leaves us with this simple truth: treating the ground beneath our feet with reverence and grace is a prayer in and of itself. This is Stellar Eureka, signing off.